Now, in the previous chapter, we had looked at the concept of stopping and starting a VM either from the VM itself or from the Azure portal. Now, apart from the temporary storage, the D drive, we had also seen that the public IP address of the machine also changes. So if you do a shutdown or a restart from the VM itself, then your IP address will not change. So your dynamic IP address. But if you stop the machine from the Azure portal, then the IP address will change. Now you can allocate a static IP address that does not change even if you stop the machine from the Azure portal itself. Now a common question I get from students is, why should I even bother about the IP address? What happens if the IP address changes? So if you're hosting a website on the virtual machine, so let's say it's cloudportalhub.com. Now, when your users actually type this URL in the browser, in the end, this DNS name will actually point onto an IP address. Let's say this is the IP address that has been assigned onto your virtual machine. So this mapping of the DNS name onto the IP address is the default pattern, because I said that the IP address is used to uniquely identify or just find out the location of the machine itself. It's like the address of the machine. So if you stop the VM from the Azure portal, and if it gets a new public IP address, and this IP address is no longer valid, that means your site will stop working. You will need to again remap your site onto the new IP address. And if you have an e-commerce site, and if you have customers that are buying off the site, you can't afford to have this loss in behavior. So you need to ensure that your IP address does not change. So this is one of the biggest use case as to why you would want to have a static IP address. So here I am in Azure. Now I have a virtual machine in place. So here it has a public IP address. Now if you want to mark this as a static IP address, so remember that if you restart the machine, the public IP address will not change. It's only when you stop the machine here, then it will change the public IP address. So if you want to mark this as a static IP address, go ahead and click on the public IP address. Now here, if you don't see the option to mark it static, sometimes you might have the option to mark this as static and then you can click on save. But if not, then this is a process that we need to follow. Firstly, go on to Demo VM, go on to the networking section. Here, go on to the network interface, go on to IP configurations, go on to the IP config, and first we need to disassociate the public IP address from the machine. So here I'll choose disassociate and then I'll click on save. So the first step is to first delink the public IP address from the machine. This will just take a couple of minutes. So once this is done, if I go back now on to all resources, and if I go on to the public IP address that is part of the machine, but we've just delinked it, so I'll go on to it. Here, if I go on to configuration, now I can mark it as static, and let me go ahead and click on save. So this will mark now the IP address as static. Now I'll go back onto all resources. I'll go on to my demo VM machine. I'll go on networking. I'll go on to the network interface. I'll go on to IP configurations. I'll go on to the IP config, and let me associate the same public IP address again and let me hit on save. Now remember that this public IP address is now behaving as a static IP address. So now even if you stop the Azure virtual machine, it will not change the public IP address. So let's wait again till this is complete. Now once this is complete, if I go back onto my machine, if I go on to the overview, here we can see our public IP address. If I click on the public IP address, now this is marked as a static IP address. So if you want to ensure that your public IP address doesn't change after you stop the virtual machine, you can go ahead and mark it as a static IP address.